The Whitaker family had always lived on Hollowfield Farm. It was an isolated patch of land surrounded by miles of dense forest, with a crooked, winding road the only path in or out. The farm had been in the family for generations, but over the years, something about the place had changed. The soil seemed sick, yielding only pale, stunted crops. The livestock were restless, their eyes dull and clouded. And then there were the noises. Whispers carried on the wind at night, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably there. The family consisted of Harold, the gruff but hard-working father, his wife, Evelyn, whose health had been declining for months, their teenage daughter, Clara, who dreamed of leaving the farm behind, and their youngest, 7-year-old Peter, a quiet boy who had taken to wandering the woods more and more often. It began with the barn. One evening, Clara heard strange noises coming from inside, wet, slapping sounds, and the low, guttural moan of something that wasn't quite animal. She told Harold, who grabbed his shotgun and stormed out to investigate. Evelyn and the children waited in tense silence. When Harold returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling. "Some animal got in," he said, though he wouldn't elaborate. "Took care of it. Go to bed." But Clara noticed the shotgun was still fully loaded. That night, Clara was awakened by the sound of scratching at her window. Her room was on the second floor. She froze, her breath caught in her throat, and stared at the window. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low whisper. "Clara!" She bolted to her parents' room, but Harold dismissed her story, blaming it on nightmares. Evelyn sat silently in the corner, her skin pale and clammy, staring at the wall with unseeing eyes. Clara didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following morning, Peter didn't come back from the woods. Harold and Clara searched for hours, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. They found him just before sunset, standing at the edge of the tree line, staring at the house. His clothes were filthy, and his hands were caked with mud. When Harold asked where he'd been, Peter only said, "They showed me something." "Who?" Clara pressed, but Peter wouldn't answer. He smiled, though, and it was a smile that made her stomach turn. That night, the family sat down to dinner in uneasy silence. Evelyn barely touched her food, her fork trembling in her frail hand. Peter hummed to himself, a tuneless melody that grated on Clara's nerves. Halfway through the meal, Harold stood up abruptly, his face pale. He excused himself, saying he'd forgotten to lock the barn. Clara watched him through the window as he crossed the yard with his lantern. She could see the light swaying in the dark as he entered the barn, but then it went out. Moments later, she saw a figure emerge, but it wasn't her father. It was tall and gangly, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. Its head cocked to the side, as if listening for something, then it turned and stared directly at Clara through the window. She screamed, and Evelyn's fork clattered to the floor. When Clara turned back to the window, the figure was gone. Harold didn't return that night. By morning, Evelyn was bedridden, her breath shallow and rasping. Clara stayed by her side, trying to get her to drink water, but Evelyn only muttered incoherently. Peter sat in the corner, drawing pictures in the dirt with his finger. When Clara glanced at them, she felt her blood run cold. They were symbols, strange, looping patterns that seemed to pulse and writhe when she looked at them too long. That evening, Clara decided to check the barn herself. She armed herself with Harold's shotgun and a lantern, her hands trembling as she pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The smell hit her first, a rancid stench of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. The lantern's light fell on the floor, and she saw the source of the smell. Dead animals, their bodies torn apart, arranged in a circle. In the center was a mound of dirt, pulsing as if something beneath it was alive. Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding. The dirt shifted, and she realized it wasn't dirt at all. It was flesh, pale and glistening, writhing with tiny, insect-like creatures. As she watched, a face began to emerge from the mass. Her father's face. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to scream. She stumbled back, tripping over something soft. She looked down and saw another body. Her mother, her face frozen in a mask of terror, her chest caved in as if something had burst out from within. Clara fled the barn, her screams echoing in the night. She ran back to the house, but it was empty. Peter was gone, and the strange symbols he'd drawn were now etched into the walls, glowing faintly. The whispers were louder now, surrounding her, filling her head. She grabbed a bag, threw in whatever she could find, and ran. As she reached the edge of the farm, she saw Peter standing in the field. He turned to her, his eyes black as coal, and smiled that same chilling smile. "You can't leave," he said, his voice layered with others, deep and guttural. "It's part of you now." Clara turned and ran, her sobs tearing through the cold night air. She didn't stop until she reached the main road, where a passing trucker found her, hysterical and covered in dirt. Years later, Clara tried to move on, but the farm never let her go. Every night, she dreamed of the barn, the mound of flesh, and her brother's black eyes. And every morning, she woke to find symbols carved into her walls, glowing faintly in the dark.